They prided themselves on keeping every blade of grass at regulation height and every mailbox in identical, unblemished condition. It wasn't a neighborhood. It was a showroom. And right in the middle of that pristine little world stood my house, with a yard that had seen better days. I wasn't a slob. The grass wasn't waist-high. There weren't car parts littered about. But after a busy spring at work, I'd fallen behind. A few weeds poked through the mulch, some hedges had grown shaggy, and the once bright flower beds had dulled to tired patches of dirt. That was enough to put me on the radar. When I opened the door that morning, there it was. A crisp, white envelope taped firmly to the glass. The HOA's emblem was stamped on the front in bold red ink, as if they wanted to make sure my neighbors saw it from the street. Inside was a neatly typed letter, written in the cold, sterile tone only bureaucrats can master. They claimed my yard violated community guidelines for aesthetic uniformity. The penalty was clear: a $100 fine for every day I failed to restore my property to acceptable neighborhood standards. $100. Daily. I could almost feel the smug smiles of the HOA board radiating from the page. They probably pictured me panicking, racing out to hire landscapers, bowing to their power. But they didn't know me very well. I've never been the type to take orders from people who think clipboards give them authority. At first, I considered doing the obvious, trimming the bushes, planting a few flowers, paying for quick curb appeal. But as I read the letter again, the tone gnawed at me. This wasn't a friendly reminder. It was a threat, written by people who got their sense of purpose from telling others what color mulch to buy. That's when the anger set in. If they wanted to fine me for ugly landscaping, I'd give them landscaping they'd never forget. Not the kind you pay a gardener for, the kind that draws a crowd. I spent that night sketching ideas in the dim glow of my kitchen light. What if I leaned into their definition of ugly? What if I made my yard so outrageous that their rules looked ridiculous in comparison? My mind spun with possibilities. Bright colors, oversized decorations, bizarre sculptures that had no business being in a suburban front lawn. Something that would make every passing car stop and stare. But I knew I had to be smart about it. This couldn't just be chaos. It needed to be deliberate, a calculated act of defiance. And more importantly, it had to be legal. I studied the HOA bylaws with the precision of a lawyer, looking for every loophole, every vague phrase I could exploit. The rules were strict, but they weren't bulletproof. If I stayed technically within the guidelines, they couldn't do anything except stew in their own fury. The next morning, I walked my property, not as a homeowner, but as an artist preparing a canvas. Every patch of grass, every strip of dirt, every inch of hedge became potential material. I began ordering supplies, things no HOA had ever dreamed would appear in one of their manicured subdivisions. Brightly colored lawn ornaments, solar lights in every color of the rainbow, giant plastic flamingos, and more, much, much more. Within days, deliveries piled up on my driveway. Neighbors slowed down as they drove by, curiosity sparking behind their polite smiles. They didn't know what I was planning, but they knew it wasn't ordinary. I could almost feel the HOA board peeking from behind their blinds, wondering what I was up to. And then, late one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I began. Piece by piece, I transformed my yard, not into a tidy HOA-approved postcard, but into something completely outrageous, something no rulebook could have anticipated. By sunrise, the first stage was complete. I stood on the curb, coffee in hand, and admired my work as the neighborhood woke up. One by one, curtains slid open. One by one, neighbors came outside to gawk. And then, as expected, a sleek black sedan rolled slowly down the street. The HOA president. She stopped in front of my house, jaw tightening, phone already in hand. I smiled, because this was only the beginning. By the second morning, word had already spread. The once quiet street, where neighbors usually passed by with the same rehearsed smiles and curt nods, now buzzed with whispers and sidelong glances. My yard, no longer just a patch of grass and hedges, had become a spectacle. It started with the neighbors across the street stepping out onto their porch to snap photos with their phones, pretending to check the weather while recording every inch of my so-called violation. The display itself was hard to ignore. Bright flamingos staked in every corner, solar lights flashing in mismatched colors, and a massive inflatable dragon sitting proudly in the center of my lawn as though guarding some suburban treasure. Plastic gnomes stood at attention along the walkway, each one painted in neon shades of orange, green, and purple. There was no rhyme or reason to the madness, but there didn't need to be. It was loud. It was absurd. And most importantly, it was within the technical limits of the HOA's own rules. The HOA president returned that afternoon, her black sedan rolling to a halt at the curb like a hearse at a funeral. She didn't even try to hide her fury this time. She circled the perimeter of my yard, phone camera clicking, no doubt compiling evidence for the next letter. But I had studied the bylaws carefully. Nothing I'd done technically broke their aesthetic uniformity clause because there were no specific prohibitions on colors, decorations, or inflatable dragons. The only requirement was that the property be maintained. And oh, it was maintained. By day 3, curious passersby began slowing their cars to take a look. Some parked on the street just to walk by and gawk at the absurdity. A few even gave me a thumbs up as they passed, though most of the HOA loyalists glared at me like I had set their perfect little world on fire. By the weekend, it was no longer just neighbors. Strangers from other parts of town started showing up after hearing about the circus yard. Families stopped to take pictures. Teenagers posed with the dragon, laughing as they posted videos online. Someone tagged the location on social media, and within hours, the photos went viral in our little community. What was supposed to be an HOA shaming campaign had turned into free publicity for me. Of course, the board didn't see it that way. That Saturday, an emergency HOA meeting was called at the clubhouse down the street. I didn't attend. I wasn't about to waste a perfectly good morning listening to them complain about how my lawn decorations were ruining property values. But I didn't need to be there to know what was said. Later, neighbors filled me in. The president ranted for an hour about how my actions were an attack on the integrity of the neighborhood. Others on the board worried that more people might copy my idea if they didn't crack down fast. That same afternoon, a second letter appeared on my door. This one was even angrier than the first. They accused me of creating a public nuisance and warned of legal action if I didn't remove the decorations immediately. But once again, the language in their own bylaws worked against them. There was no specific clause against public attention. They had no legal grounds to fine me for what they simply didn't like. I could practically hear their teeth grinding from across the street. But the funniest part? My yard started attracting money. Local food trucks parked nearby to serve the weekend crowds. A novelty t-shirt shop began selling shirts with pictures of the dragon and the phrase, "Welcome to the HOA circus." Someone even slipped me $20 to let their kid's birthday party take photos in front of my lawn. What was supposed to cost me $100 a day was suddenly paying me instead. The board doubled down. They sent out flyers to every homeowner warning them not to encourage disruptive behavior, and reminded everyone that HOA fees could be raised to cover community legal costs. That only made them more unpopular. People who had once been scared of the board's authority now started questioning why a few uptight neighbors got to decide what everyone's house should look like. By the end of the week, the tension in the neighborhood was unbearable. Some residents quietly admired what I'd done, seeing it as a stand against petty control. Others muttered under their breath when I walked by, accusing me of embarrassing the community. And then there were those who didn't take sides at all but couldn't resist snapping selfies in front of the dragon every time they passed. It was only a matter of time before the situation spilled beyond our street. Local news outlets picked up the story after social media videos racked up thousands of views. Reporters showed up with cameras, interviewing neighbors on the sidewalk. They called it the Dragon War, a battle between a stubborn homeowner and an even more stubborn HOA. I watched the broadcast from my living room with a grin, sipping coffee as the anchor described my front yard as a tourist attraction in the heart of suburbia. But while I was enjoying the chaos, I knew the HOA wouldn't stop here. They couldn't stand losing. And if I had learned anything about people who love power, it's that they'll burn the whole neighborhood down before admitting defeat. So I prepared for their next move. I doubled down on my decorations, adding new features every few days to keep people talking. A giant pirate ship made of plywood. A row of mannequin scarecrows dressed in outrageous costumes. Wind chimes big enough to be heard 3 streets over. Every addition drew bigger crowds, and every crowd pushed the HOA closer to the edge. By the end of that second week, the board president parked her car outside my house for nearly an hour, just watching as people lined up to take pictures. Her face was pale with rage. She wasn't just angry, she was plotting. And I knew, deep down, that whatever came next wouldn't just be a letter. The HOA had been humiliated, and humiliation is a powerful motivator for people who live to control others. By the 3rd week, my yard had gone from a neighborhood curiosity to a full-blown spectacle. Cars lined both sides of the street. Families posed for photos beside the inflatable dragon. Teenagers filmed TikToks on my pirate ship, and local vendors made brisk business selling snacks to the weekend crowds. What was supposed to be a punishment had turned into a party. But the HOA wasn't smiling. Their first counterattack came quietly. Early one morning, a man in a reflective vest appeared at the edge of my property. He wasn't one of the neighbors. He carried a clipboard and spent 20 minutes measuring distances between the decorations and the sidewalk. A few days later, another man came, this time with a camera, photographing every corner of my yard as if preparing evidence for trial. Soon after, I received the 3rd letter. It was thicker than the others, stuffed with printed pages quoting obscure sections of the HOA covenant. They accused me of violating setback requirements, obstruction of pedestrian visibility, and creating a hazardous condition for emergency vehicles. They claimed my dragon blocked the view of the road, my solar lights distracted drivers, and my pirate ship created a tripping hazard, even though it was firmly anchored on my own lawn. This wasn't about safety. It was war. The letter threatened immediate legal action if I didn't remove every decoration within 72 hours. They even hinted that they'd put a lien on my home to recover accrued fines and penalties. But buried in the fine print, I found their mistake. Every accusation hinged on vague interpretations of rules that weren't written to cover situations like mine. The HOA didn't expect resistance, so they had never bothered to make their bylaws airtight. While they tried to weaponize technicalities, I armed myself with facts. I spent nights researching property law, setback measurements, and city codes. I even visited the county clerk's office to double-check the HOA's legal authority. If they wanted a fight, I'd meet them blow for blow. Meanwhile, the spectacle in my yard only grew louder. I added a 30-foot banner that read, "Welcome to the HOA Circus," framed by spinning pinwheels. I installed motion sensor speakers that played carnival music whenever someone walked by. Every addition drove more traffic and more frustration for the HOA. Then came their second counterattack. One evening, just after sunset, I noticed a police cruiser idling at the corner of the street. 2 officers stepped out and walked toward my property. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the officers inspected my decorations, jotting down notes. My heart pounded. Had the HOA somehow convinced the city to shut me down? But after a long inspection, the officers left without a word. Later, I learned from a friend at City Hall that the HOA had filed multiple complaints claiming I was violating municipal codes. The city investigated, but found no wrongdoing. My yard was bizarre, yes, but perfectly legal. The board president didn't take that well. The next day, she personally marched door to door with a petition, trying to rally neighbors to vote me out of the community. She framed it as a fight for property values and neighborhood dignity. Some signed. Others slammed their doors in her face. The subdivision was split down the middle. I knew I couldn't rely on neighbors to shield me, but I didn't need to. The public had already taken my side. Local media now ran weekly updates on the Dragon War, and people from outside the HOA community openly mocked the board's behavior. Every time they tried to paint me as a villain, it backfired. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that they were preparing something bigger. They had tried intimidation, legal threats, and even law enforcement. None of it worked. That left them with only one option: direct confrontation. It happened late one night. Around midnight, I heard a strange noise outside. A metallic clank, followed by a dull thud. My stomach tightened as I peeked through the blinds. A figure moved in the dark, crouched low near the base of the inflatable dragon. A second figure stood watch at the curb. They weren't teenagers pulling a prank. These were adults. I stepped outside, phone in hand, and they bolted. The first figure, carrying a box cutter, dropped something as he ran. When I picked it up, I felt my blood boil. It was an HOA-branded clipboard. This wasn't random vandalism. The board had escalated from letters to sabotage. I patched up the dragon and installed security cameras around the property. By morning, I had clear footage of two people in hoodies attempting to slash my decorations. One of them, even with the hood, was unmistakable. The HOA treasurer. I turned the footage over to the police and then, for good measure, posted it online. The video went viral in hours. Strangers who'd never set foot in our neighborhood flooded the HOA's Facebook page with angry comments, demanding resignations. News stations replayed the clip on loop, calling it a stunning escalation in a suburban standoff. The HOA thought they could scare me into submission. Instead, they'd made themselves look corrupt and desperate. But I knew they wouldn't quit now, not after being publicly humiliated. They'd double down because that's what people like them always do. The question wasn't whether they'd retaliate. It was how far they were willing to go. And the answer came sooner than I expected. The moment the video of the HOA treasurer slashing my inflatable dragon hit the internet, everything changed. What had started as a petty neighborhood feud was now a full-blown scandal. The footage spread like wildfire, drawing outrage from people far outside our quiet subdivision. Comment sections filled with demands for the HOA board to step down, and some even called for criminal charges. Local news stations swarmed the neighborhood, their vans parked at the curb as reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk. But if the board felt any shame, they didn't show it. Instead, they came back harder. Days after the video went viral, I received a thick envelope delivered by certified mail. Not another HOA warning, but an official lawsuit. They were dragging me to court. The complaint accused me of creating an ongoing public nuisance, violating multiple community harmony clauses, and intentionally damaging neighborhood property values. They demanded immediate removal of every decoration and payment of thousands in accrued fines. They even claimed the viral attention I generated had caused irreparable harm to the reputation of the HOA. I wasn't shocked. I'd expected them to weaponize the legal system, but I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. They were suing me for embarrassing them, after they'd been caught trying to vandalize my property. Still, a lawsuit was no joke. I spent sleepless nights researching case law, talking to attorneys, and piecing together every scrap of evidence I had. Photos, receipts, city code documents, video footage. Anything that proved my yard, as wild as it looked, was completely legal. The first hearing was surreal. Inside the courtroom, the HOA board sat together like a row of vultures, dressed in their Sunday best, glaring at me as if I were on trial for treason. Their attorney, a sharp-tongued man who clearly relished the fight, painted me as a menace, a rogue homeowner who had turned a peaceful neighborhood into a circus for personal profit. But my defense was simple. Everything I'd done was within the rules. My property was well-maintained, nothing obstructed public streets or sidewalks, and every decoration complied with city ordinances. I wasn't the one breaking laws, they were. I had security footage of board members trespassing and attempting vandalism, and I made sure the judge saw it. The tension was electric as arguments went back and forth. The HOA attorney spoke of chaos, crowds, and loss of property value. I spoke of individual rights, homeowner freedom, and abuse of power. The gallery, packed with neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers, murmured with every exchange. Outside the courthouse, the battle spilled into the streets. Supporters cheered me on, holding signs that read, "Let the dragon fly," while angry HOA loyalists muttered that I was destroying the community. The board president, still furious from her public humiliation, doubled down in interviews, calling me a selfish troublemaker. But every time she spoke, she only made herself look worse. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day. Instead, he ordered both sides to mediation, a last-ditch effort to settle the matter privately. But mediation was a disaster. The HOA demanded total surrender, remove every decoration, pay their legal fees, and sign a pledge never to disrupt neighborhood aesthetics again. I refused outright. If they wanted to destroy my yard, they'd have to do it in open court in front of the same cameras recording every move. As the case dragged on, the spectacle at my house grew even bigger. People showed up from other towns just to see the display that had sparked a legal war. Local businesses offered sponsorship deals to fund the Dragon Yard. I even received letters from strangers offering free materials to make the attraction bigger. The HOA hated every second of it. Their desperate attempts to control the narrative only backfired. The treasurer, who had been caught on video vandalizing my property, was forced to resign after police issued a citation. The board president faced relentless public criticism, with residents openly questioning why HOA dues were being spent on lawsuits instead of community improvements. But even with their crumbling support, they pressed on. Court hearings stretched for weeks, each one drawing larger crowds and more media attention. I had turned my suburban front yard into a battleground for something much bigger than landscaping. It had become a fight over freedom, authority, and who really controlled the neighborhood. I could feel the board's desperation growing. Their legal strategy shifted from claiming my yard was ugly to claiming it was unsafe, citing traffic congestion caused by curious visitors. They even brought in an expert witness to testify that my dragon display lowered surrounding home values. But I countered with evidence showing home prices hadn't dropped a penny. In fact, several had sold for record amounts thanks to the sudden fame of the neighborhood. By the final hearing, the board looked exhausted. Their attorneys' arguments were flimsy. The judge, clearly frustrated with the HOA's antics, questioned why they had ignored their own covenant language and pursued such aggressive tactics. Then came the ruling. The judge dismissed nearly every claim against me. The court found that my decorations were fully compliant with both HOA rules and municipal codes. The board was ordered to pay its own legal fees, and the judge issued a stern warning against further harassment. My yard, ridiculous as it was, had officially won. But victory didn't end the war. If anything, it lit a fire under the HOA. Losing in court humiliated them even more, and I could see it in their faces as they filed out of the courtroom. They weren't done, not by a long shot. The president avoided the cameras, her jaw tight with rage. I knew she was already planning her next move. If they couldn't beat me legally, they'd try to beat me another way. And sure enough, just days later, the battle spilled out of the courtroom and into the streets, in a way no one expected. The courtroom defeat should have ended it. The judge's ruling was clear. My yard was legal, my decorations were compliant, and the HOA had no right to fine me a single dollar. For any reasonable board, that would have been the end of the fight. But this board wasn't reasonable. They weren't satisfied with losing. They wanted revenge. The shift was subtle at first. I noticed unfamiliar cars idling at odd hours near my house, their engines running just long enough to make me uneasy. Then came the anonymous letters. Unmarked envelopes stuffed with printed messages telling me to leave before it gets worse. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to began receiving HOA flyers accusing me of ruining the community and attracting dangerous crowds. The campaign to isolate me was deliberate. They couldn't find me anymore, so they tried to turn the neighborhood against me. Overnight, friendly waves from passing cars disappeared. Parents steered their children to the opposite sidewalk. The once playful selfies people snapped in front of my inflatable dragon were replaced by whispered complaints about traffic, noise, and lowered property values. But I knew this wasn't coming from ordinary neighbors. This was orchestrated. Soon, the board escalated again. Mysterious complaints were filed against me with the city, reports of illegal construction, excessive noise, even hazardous waste. Inspectors showed up at my property unannounced, walking the perimeter with puzzled looks when they found nothing wrong. Each visit ended the same way. No violations, no citations, just wasted time. But I could see the pattern. The HOA was using every channel of bureaucracy they could find, hoping to wear me down through sheer harassment. Their tactics grew bolder. Late one night, My security cameras caught someone tossing garbage onto my lawn. Bags filled with rotting food, meant to make it look like I wasn't maintaining the property. Another night, a stranger pried open my mailbox and scattered its contents across the driveway. The footage was grainy, but I didn't need perfect clarity to know who was behind it. And yet, I refused to back down. For every act of sabotage, I responded by making the yard even more outrageous. A giant rotating clown head appeared next to the dragon. Life-size cardboard cutouts of celebrities lined the walkway. I installed a bubble machine that filled the street with floating spheres every afternoon, drawing even bigger crowds. The HOA wanted to make me miserable, but all they managed to do was make me louder. The attention reached a breaking point. Local radio stations ran segments about the most infamous yard in town. Weekend traffic in the neighborhood became so heavy that police had to direct cars at the intersection. Not because of danger, but because so many people wanted to see the spectacle. Food trucks returned, joined by ice cream carts and souvenir vendors selling HOA circus merchandise. The board president snapped. Neighbors told me she'd been holding secret meetings with her remaining loyalists, plotting ways to take back control. When public pressure forced her to stop using HOA funds for legal battles, she started working outside the official channels. The harassment campaign intensified. My trash cans mysteriously went missing. A landscaping service I'd hired to trim my backyard hedges canceled at the last minute, saying they'd received complaints. Even my internet service was briefly disconnected after a bogus report of unauthorized usage. But the turning point came when someone tried to damage more than just decorations. One night, around 2 in the morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of metal scraping against concrete. I rushed to the window and saw headlights flashing in my driveway. A pickup truck was backing into my lawn, its bed filled with debris. The driver dumped a pile of broken pallets and scrap metal across my flower beds before speeding off into the darkness. I reviewed the footage and sent it straight to the police. This time, it wasn't just vandalism, it was criminal dumping. And although the license plate was partially obscured, the make and model of the truck matched one owned by a close friend of the HOA president. Word spread quickly. When the story hit the local news, complete with video of the truck, the HOA board found itself cornered. Reporters swarmed the president's house, demanding answers. Residents who had stayed neutral now openly condemned the board's tactics. What had once been a battle over lawn decorations had become a referendum on abuse of power. But even as the board fractured under public outrage, the president refused to give up. She doubled down on her narrative, telling anyone who would listen that I had brought this on myself and was tearing apart the community for attention. Her arrogance only made things worse. By now, the yard had grown into something almost unbelievable, part roadside attraction, part carnival, part protest. Tour buses stopped by during the day. At night, strings of colorful lights illuminated the dragon and pirate ship like a suburban theme park. I hadn't planned for it to get this big, but it had become more than just a joke. It was a statement. The HOA president, desperate and humiliated, made one last move. She scheduled an emergency neighborhood vote to amend the HOA bylaws, adding new restrictions specifically targeting my display. If she succeeded, the board could bypass the court ruling and legally force me to dismantle everything. But she underestimated just how much her own behavior had alienated the neighborhood. Many who once disliked my decorations now saw me as the lesser evil compared to her corruption. Residents who had stayed silent began speaking out, furious that their HOA dues were funding personal vendettas. The vote was set for a Saturday morning in the clubhouse. I knew it would be ugly. The board would throw everything they had at me, and the outcome would determine whether the dragon stayed or whether the HOA finally got its victory. The night before the vote, I stood on the curb, looking at the glowing lights, the bubble machine still hissing out clouds of foam, the inflatable dragon swaying in the breeze. What started as a petty fine had become something much bigger, a fight for the right to stand up to people drunk on power. I wasn't sure what would happen in that clubhouse, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going down quietly. The day of reckoning came sooner than anyone expected. After weeks of escalating tension, The HOA finally scheduled a full community hearing to decide my fate. Word spread quickly. What should have been a dull neighborhood meeting turned into a public spectacle. By the time I arrived, the small clubhouse was overflowing. Neighbors, local reporters, and even strangers who had driven in just to see the drama unfold stood shoulder to shoulder in the parking lot. The HOA had no idea their closed-door hearing had become the main event in town. Inside, the board sat stiffly behind a long table, shuffling papers as if they were preparing for trial. They spoke of standards, aesthetic integrity, and property value decline. They waved photographs of my yard as if holding evidence of a crime. Every photo, the giant pink flamingo, the mirrored mosaic path, the fountain shaped like a dragon, drew murmurs of amusement from the crowd. The HOA tried to paint it as vandalism, but to everyone else it looked like art. Their case fell apart the moment I calmly explained how every feature on my property was legal, meticulously maintained, and, most importantly, attracting business to the town. I laid out hard numbers. In just 1 month, the tourist traffic my yard drew had boosted local cafes, gift shops, and gas stations. The mayor himself had sent a letter thanking me for bringing visitors to our sleepy community. When I handed that letter to the board, they froze. Outside, more and more people gathered. Social media live streams showed hundreds watching the proceedings, cheering every time the HOA was forced to acknowledge that I had technically broken no rules. My yard, once called ugly landscaping, was now being praised as an unofficial roadside attraction. The HOA's argument crumbled under the weight of public opinion and hard evidence. They realized that pushing for fines would only make them look petty, and possibly land them in legal trouble for harassment. By the end of the hearing, the board reluctantly announced they were withdrawing all fines and dropping their demands for me to restore my yard. Their statement was short and bitter, but the moment it was read aloud, the crowd erupted in applause. I walked out of that room not just vindicated but celebrated. Neighbors who had once been indifferent now greeted me with smiles. Small business owners thanked me for the surge in weekend visitors. Even kids asked to take pictures with the dragon fountain as if it were a celebrity. But victory didn't mean things went quiet. In fact, my yard became more popular than ever. Local artists asked to contribute their own creations. A retired carpenter built an ornate wooden arch over my driveway. A young painter added colorful murals along my fence line. What started as an act of defiance had grown into a living, breathing gallery that belonged to the entire community. Tour buses began stopping by on weekends. Travel bloggers wrote articles. What the HOA had called an eyesore had become the crown jewel of the neighborhood. The board members tried to save face. They claimed they had only been enforcing standards, but everyone knew the truth. They had underestimated one homeowner's determination, and now they had no choice but to coexist with something they couldn't control. Months later, the same HOA that once threatened to fine me began using my yard in their own brochures. They called it a unique neighborhood landmark. It was a bitterly ironic twist. The very thing they'd fought to destroy had become their selling point. Looking back, I realized that this battle wasn't just about landscaping or fines. It was about standing up to arbitrary authority. It was about proving that one person could push back, stay within the rules, and still win, loudly, colorfully, and unapologetically. My yard remains a tourist attraction to this day. Families stop to take pictures. Couples propose in front of the dragon fountain. Street performers sometimes set up for tips on the weekends. And the HOA? They stay quiet now, probably praying I never get another ugly landscaping idea. But here's the best part. Every time I look at my yard, I remember that I didn't just beat the HOA. I turned their $100 a day threat into something priceless.